Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here tonight for this APG Noisy Thinking event. My name is James Parsons and I am your compere this evening, and I will be chairing what promises to be a fascinating, lively and passionate discussion on the subject of love. Now, many people in the world of marketing and communications have traditionally taken for granted the idea that 80% of a brand's volume comes from the 20% of people who buy it most frequently. And this so-called Pareto law has given rise to a vision of the world in which great and profitable brands are great and profitable because of their ability to garner deep, loyal relationships of love with loyal franchises. It has given rise to a vision of the world in which consumers in consumer societies might be defined by their brand choices. It's given rise to a vision of the world in which consumers actively seek out brands to define who they are, to define their identities. And hand in hand with this thinking comes the assumption that if a brand is to grow, it must achieve ever greater loyalty from that loyal bunch of consumers. It must establish relationships of love. And on the back of that thinking comes a further assumption that the job of advertising is to create ever deeper relationships of loyalty and love between brands and their consumers. To create what Kevin Roberts calls loyalty beyond reason. Byron Sharp, in his work How Brands Grow, has put a cat amongst the pigeons, and those pigeons are still in the air and they haven't quite landed yet. His work, empirically supported by data, suggests that the Pareto law is not, in fact, a law. He suggests that it's absolutely not the case that 80% of a brand's volume comes from the 20% of its buyers who buy it most frequently. He suggests, based on his research, which is very, very wide-ranging, that independent of culture, category, time, the Pareto share tends to be something much more like 50%. 50% of a brand's value comes from the 20% of its buyers who buy it most frequently. He argues, furthermore, that when brands have grown, they've done so by increasing their penetration. They have got people simply to buy it, to try it out at least once during a given period. He also argues that when brands have declined, they've declined because they have lost penetration, not because consumers have become less loyal to those brands. And he also suggests that amongst that 20% that we're talking about, well, who's to say that those people are in love with your brand anyway and have a deep, deep relationship with it, or that they define themselves by dint of that brand, or that they define their identity by dint of that brand. And so, apparently, we live in a world where promiscuity is rife, where penetration is the name of the game and not love. Or do we? We live in a world in which brands can't hope to grow if they try to establish relationships of ever greater loyalty with a loyal franchise of consumers. Or do we? We live in a world where advertising is at its most effective, not when it creates and cements bonds of loyalty and love with a loyal base of consumers, but when it creates salience. The kind of salience that leads to mental availability, the kind of mental availability that prompts the propensity to trial, that prompts penetration. Or do we? Here to debate these issues, I'd like to introduce our panel, starting with two women who have a proud and confident place in the laboratory of marketing science. They promise not to cry if criticized, neither to fall in love with their male counterparts. First of all, Jane Lingham, who is Director of Brand at the BBC, an organisation or a brand which I would bet money there are several people in this audience who would say they have some kind of feeling of love towards that organisation. She will be talking about the question of love as a question of existential importance for the brand that she runs. Next to her is Kirsty Fuller. Kirsty Fuller is the co-founder of Flamingo, widely regarded to be the premier offering in the space of consumer and cultural insight and brand and communications consultancy. Kirsty founded the company together with Maggie Collier in the mid-90s with a team of around 5. She has since been fundamentally and instrumental in growing that team to approaching 300 in 7 locations around the world. Kirsty also happens to have been my boss for the past 22 years, I should say, but not this evening, because I'm the compere. Across the divide, I would like to introduce the panel's striding man, who will be talking against love with a twinkle in his monocle and his top hat jauntily cocked forward. For this is Mark Murray, the head of global head of consumer planning at Diageo, an organisation which has a wide portfolio of brands including Johnnie Walker, Baileys, Smirnoff, Tanqueray and others. And he's joined by Laurence Green, a man who you will agree has a look of innocence about him, but who has a reputation for being a bit of a smoothie. He is the founder of the agency 101, one of London's most exciting agencies, an agency which includes on its client list the likes of the BBC, Diageo, Kettle Chips, Scottish Widows, Tango, and the aforementioned Innocent Smoothie. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your panel. Jane, could I ask you to start? What on earth has love got to do with it?
Thanks, James. Good evening, everyone. Well, I wanted to start by saying that I was absolutely delighted when James asked me if I would speak on this panel this evening. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not immune to all of the writings and musings that have been written dismissing the idea of love and brands. But I'm afraid I just don't buy the idea that brand love isn't important. It is. And I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to tell you why. But let me start by clarifying what I think we mean when we say brand love. I don't think people love brands like they love their children. I think that would be kind of absurd. I think that when people say that they love a brand, they use the word love as a metaphor for other positive emotions, which result in them feeling a strong emotional connection to a brand. And in the same way that our connections to people, places and ideas help to define our social and personal identities, I think so too do our connection to brands. And connections are important. We all know it's easier to persuade somebody to do something when they like you, and even easier to persuade them to do something when they really love you. I'm sure I don't need to tell you in this room that that's true. I think you can probably all draw on your life experiences for that. So if you agree that the more connected you are to someone and the more positively they feel towards you, the more effective you tend to be at persuading them to do something, how can it be that brand love is irrelevant in a world of branding and communications which are all about persuasion? That to me is just common sense. Now, I am aware of and do agree with much of what Sharp says. In fact, I invited his company into the BBC to talk to my team about his philosophy, and they made lots of sense. For example, the idea that accessibility and that prominence is key to driving brand growth seems logical. In fact, it's another example of common sense. If your consumers can't get hold of you, it will be quite hard for your brand to grow. But I also find much of what Sharp claims quite short-sighted, and I'm particularly interested in what he says about mental availability. Sharp argues that when it comes to making your product mentally available to consumers, meaningless distinction is completely valid. He says as long as there is something about your brand that sticks in consumers' minds, it doesn't really matter if it has any validity with the category that you're in. And maybe some of the time, or to a certain extent, that might be true. For example, what have apples got to do with computers? But whilst the word Apple per se might not have much to do with computers, the values that the brand stands for, simple, usable design, are highly meaningful within the sector. And those values have inspired a fan base of some of the most loyal brand fans on earth. So whilst the name Apple might not have had much meaning when it started out, the brand which Steve Jobs built around it, or the meaning he gave it, absolutely does. So much for meaningless distinction. And as we all know, Apple are one of the great success stories of our time. In fact, in January this year, Apple declared the biggest profits ever made by a company at £120 billion. Oh, and incidentally, what brand regularly tops brand love lists? You've guessed it, it's Apple. But let's get back to his ideas about physical availability and prominence. Just like Sharp, I believe that, of course, availability of your brand is important. At the BBC, we know from our experience of creating digital products that the more accessible something is, the more used it will be. For example, we know that people who use BBC iPlayer via the website will use it much less frequently than people who use it as an app on their smartphone. And that's just due to the fact that the app is more prominent. Content is just a click away. If we were a commercial company, this ease of use would translate into volume of sales, and that would be crucial. But at the BBC, we're in a fortunate position where currently reach, or availability, as Sharp would describe it, is not generally a limiting factor for us. Our content is highly available and encounterable. We reach around 97% of the UK population every week, across multiple devices and hundreds of channels. We're chosen 180 million times every day in the UK, and we invest a lot in telling people about upcoming programmes precisely to Sharp's point, so that they know it's available. Maintaining that prominence is clearly something we can't take for granted. As the amount of freely available content mushrooms across a greater range of connected devices, we will lose out unless we take lessons from Byron's work around ensuring physical availability. But because we're a public sector organisation with a public remit, just being chosen isn't enough. We also need to make sure that people feel good about the fact that they choose us. And that's because at the BBC, we don't have a financial bottom line. Our marker of success isn't profit, it's public approval. If people don't support the BBC, the government will take away our funding and the BBC will not exist. In simple terms, the BBC cannot exist unless it can continually demonstrate that it has the support of the UK public. And what better, more compelling way of demonstrating support than through love? Just to demonstrate that, and to demonstrate how committed I am to the idea of brand love, I want to show you a recent campaign which we developed at the BBC, which speaks to that very point. Could you play the film, please?
There's nothing you can do that can't be done. Nothing you can sing that can't be sung. Nothing you can say, but you can learn how to play the game. It's easy. There's nothing you can make that can't be made. No one you can save that can't be saved. Nothing you can do, but you can learn how to feel in time. It's easy. All you need is love. All you need is love. All you need is love, love. Love is all you need.
So I should actually say that some of my team are in the room this evening who should take much more credit for that than I can. But the objective of that as a piece of communication was really to encourage people who we know say that they love the BBC when we ask them, but take the BBC for granted day to day to be much more visible in their support for us. And the idea is that if we can create a visible groundswell of public support, it'll be much harder for government and Westminster to call for us to be disassembled or weakened. And the kind of placard-waving advocacy that we're trying to incite, I'm afraid, just isn't won through rational lobbying. It's won through emotion and love. And you're going to see much more about that campaign over the coming months. And that leads me on to another benefit of brand love, which is sustainability. If you have an emotional relationship with your consumers, when things go wrong, like they have for Marks & Spencer's, or they have most recently for the BBC with Top Gear, if you've got some credit in the bank, people are more inclined to be forgiving towards you. and stick with you regardless. So as well as a potential driver for brand growth, I would argue that love is important for protecting the future of a brand or maintaining its sustainability. So where does this leave us? Well, Sharp believes that any differentiation can make your brand distinctive, regardless of whether or not it's meaningful. I don't think that's a very sensible or sustainable long-term strategy. As I've argued, particularly in the case of the BBC, we have to make our brand meaningful. Sharp believes that prominence and availability make the world go round. But what happens in our increasingly connected global marketplace, where accessibility is becoming an expected hygiene factor as opposed to a competitive advantage? Once you've made yourself available, surely you have to make yourself desirable. And to me, it makes sense that you're more likely to do that by creating meaningful differentiation for your brand. In any case, as we all know, brands are things which actually live in the minds of our consumers, and we don't really own them at all. Even if we try to be meaningless, I suspect consumers will always attach meaning to our brands regardless. Attaching meaning to things is, after all, how we navigate and make sense of the world around us. Ultimately, though, for me, it's the premise of the dichotomy that Sharp sets out, which I think is wrong. His idea that you have to choose between either reach and distribution or love and loyalty seems unnecessary. Yes, you have to be able to access a brand in order to choose it, but what you feel about a brand is clearly important. If you still don't believe me, just think about the recent case of Starbucks and their recent tax dodging fiasco. As a result of that, their sales went down in the UK, and that wasn't because they suddenly became less available. It was because of how people felt about the brand, a clear signal that brand relationships matter. There are many research studies which support Sharp's theories, but there's also a growing body of academic research in favour of brand relationships. In some ways, it is harder to measure the impact of brand love or brand relationships on behaviour because they're less tangible. But just because you can't measure something doesn't mean it's less true. I hope then that in the last 10 minutes, I've been able to encourage you to think that love for your brand is important because it helps to build sustainable brands and it can help you protect your future. It can be a meaningful differentiator, and meaning is necessary in some sectors, like it is for the BBC. But perhaps even more than this, it's just common sense. At the end of the day, we know that it's easier to persuade people to do something when they like you. So to that end, I'd really like to buy you all a drink, and please vote in favour of brand love.
Mark Murray, what have you got to say to that?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm going to kind of not respond directly. I'll stick to my my script, and we'll hopefully respond in the questions. One of the things that's always really annoyed me about working in marketing advertising is the sort of tendency for people in business to think that marketers don't deserve to sit at the top table. That marketers are somehow insufficiently commercial, that they are people who make pretty pictures, and actually their default response to any kind of issue is to ask for more money. And if you ask people at chief executives, who are mostly accountants, sadly, that's the kind of characterization you get. And I resent this characterization because I don't think it's true. I think in brand-led organizations, the marketers are probably the most important people in the business, and certainly should be part of any decision-making, critical decision-making in that business. However, I kind of resent that accusation because I've got this sneaky suspicion that it may have some substance. I do wonder sometimes whether our default response to kind of brand challenges is to say, oh, we need to make some more pictures, and can we have some money, please? We go into meetings, we genuinely go into meetings where the brand is declining, so sales are down, and the board of the company is going, what the hell's wrong with the brand? And we go, well, we had a good link test score, we have 5 million views on YouTube, and the brand health scores are strong. And you can see people that aren't marketers going, Christ, what are they talking about? This is the dog ate my homework kind of response from marketers. It's just not good enough. And frankly, what it does do is devalue those metrics when you want to use them in other situations. So you just look like an idiot on every front, and you don't look like you have a commercial clue about what you're doing. In my role at Diageo, one of the things that I really was determined to do was to try and bring an understanding into the business, both for marketers and more broadly of how brands grow. What are the things that we need to do to make brands grow, so that we would have adult conversations between marketers and the senior executive of the company, not these kind of parent-to-child things, which is, well, your advertising's rubbish, so you need more advertising, or different advertising, fire the agency. I don't know. It's always a conversation about the campaign rather than anything beyond the campaign, and it's a ridiculous conversation. I wanted metrics that were based on that understanding of how brands grow, that allowed us to be forensic about what's going on with the brand, so that the conversation was based on a commonly understood set of metrics and a commonly understood sort of understanding of what it is that makes brands grow. And frankly, having been involved in this project for the last 18 months, I genuinely believe if you are, as a marketer or an advertiser or a creative person in this room, still believe the secret to brand growth is creating love, advocacy amongst the hardcore franchise, you don't deserve to sit at the top table, because you're basically just making it up. This understanding of buyer behavior, that it originally came from Ehrenberg and the work that Ehrenberg and his team did, has just been brought to life by Byron Sharp. It's not just Byron Sharp. The work that Peter Field and Les Binet have done with the IPA database, the amazing work that they've done with that wonderful kind of asset that we as marketers and advertisers and creative people have, keeps confirming these ideas that come forward from Byron Sharp and from Ehrenberg. You don't see Peter Field and Les Binet going, that's all bullshit. They go, crikey, we look at the award-winning cases, and they tend to be the ones that follow these ideas about penetration as against loyalty. Sorry, it's just the way it is. And similarly, I think the work that Daniel Kahneman has done and other people in behavioral economics starts to explain the why of all of this. So, you know, the data, we're observing patterns in the data, and the patterns in the data are very clear. What Kahneman does is explain why those patterns exist. In almost every other respectable profession, there is a kind of body of understanding, an accepted body of learning that the profession builds upon, that it kind of grows from. And I think these laws are our body of learning. It's been over too long, in too many categories, with too many brands and too many markets, that the patterns of buyer behavior keep reoccurring for us to even debate it. It's a null debate. We need to move on from that debate and start to do proper work, because we're actually not being seen as serious when we're ignoring the data that's in front of us. These laws do give us a set of metrics that allow us to have adult conversations with management, whoever it is, analysts, whoever that we need to have conversations with. They do help illustrate when brand budgets are insufficient, or that we need a new execution or a new campaign. So those two answers are legitimate answers, but we need to explain why those are legitimate answers. And they also help offer up other answers as to why we're not performing, which allows us to be seen as much more commercially minded, much more people that deserve to sit at the top table, because we've got a point of view based on proper data. I also want to kind of lay to rest some of your fears. One of the things that we went through at Diageo with this was, as soon as we started talking about the sort of these laws of brand growth or whatever, there's an immediate response from people going, oh, that kind of reduces the importance of creative work. You know, creative work is just kind of some generic message you send out to a broad group of people. It's precisely the opposite. If you believe that what we need to do is reach light buyers, if you believe that we need to recruit and re-recruit light buyers, then we need amazing creative work, because the people we're trying to talk to don't really care much about our brand, don't really care much about our category, so they're not predisposed to pay attention to communication from us. So it better be bloody good, because otherwise it'll just be ignored. Talking to the people that like you already is a complete waste of time. Frankly, when you talk to the people that don't know about you, don't think about you, you simultaneously talk to the people who like you anyway, because they want to pay attention to messages from your brands. So you're not losing out. People will hear from you. This isn't some reductive process where everything's reduced to a few boring truisms that we need to repeat endlessly. It's rather a framework for properly understanding how the things we can do can have maximum impact on our brand success. I genuinely believe when it comes to brand, love has got nothing to do with it. And the sooner we come to accept that, the sooner we'll be treated as kind of respectable players in marketing and advertising. Thank you.
Kirsty Fuller, I'm sure you have some perspectives to add to that.
Well, Mark. So as James will have witnessed at an internal session he ran entitled Dispelling the Myth of Brand Love, it's a subject that I get strangely emotional about because actually I love talking about it. And when James proposed to me that I join the panel, I was like Jane, delighted. And I said, where is it being held? Oh, it's that great room at Google. I love that room. Really love that location. He smiled, he turned away, he looked back and he said, oh, Kirsty, love the watch. Oh, you know, I love that watch too. Do you know what? There's a real story behind that watch. I've got another watch, probably more expensive, but you know what? That leaves me completely cold. I actually love that one and I've just bought it for my son. So you'll see I'm actually kind of all about the love. And I just don't believe that strong positive emotion, resonance with psychological drivers, things that make you smile are not an important part of our brand world and our brand choices. So Professor Sharp, let's take a look. I start calm, I start objective. I rationally absorb the data. I'm thinking about marketing purely as a science. I'm smirking at the ridiculousness of believing that Coke drinkers and Pepsi drinkers are really different, although having worked on behalf of one of those, they do believe that. And then gradually, bit by bit, I feel rather hot under the collar because the future doesn't look so bright and so orange or any other color. In fact, the future looks decidedly gray. In the opening section of his book, Byron Sharp draws the comparison between architects and marketeers. And he says that architects cannot ignore the laws of physics and the laws of engineering when they're designing buildings. They express their creativity within those parameters, and marketeers should be doing the same. They should be respecting the laws of marketing. But I can't help feeling that if we think only in Professor Sharp's terms, then we will create brands that look a little bit like this, denying any notion of loyalty, affinity, emotion, creating large packs of Pavlov dogs, and precious few like this. Now, that's not to say there aren't some highly relevant provocative learning which is giving some marketing practices a long overdue shake-up. Fascinating implications for media, fascinating implications for distribution strategy. There's not much point in being in consideration set if, quite frankly, you can't be found and you can't be seen. And there's a need to move on from assumptions around unreserved loyalty when in reality there's a huge amount of switching. But, you know, promiscuity doesn't exclude love or affection, as perhaps we might know, or the need to stop grossly upweighting the significance and importance of brands and categories in people's lives. Some categories and purchases are just not that important, and sure, we've all been in those meetings, listening to a client and wanting to say, it's a deodorant. It's not a defining dimension of identity. I take that, but I am concerned that allowing this thinking to dictate all of our brand management practices will lead to an erosion of creativity and brand meaning. If Byron Sharp talks about how brands grow, I want to think about how to grow brands. How did Hendrix become Hendrix? How did Innocent become Innocent? How did Patagonia become Patagonia? Distinctive, differentiated, meaningful brands. Was there no room for brand love, and by that I mean some kind of positive affinity, connection with those brands? Was it all about penetration, physical and mental availability, brand signifiers, and memory structures? Sounds interesting. Surely you need to know what emotions you want to create before you move on to execution. You can't tell me that cheeky, familiar tonality of Innocent didn't make people feel close to the brand, feel a certain warmth and a sense of fun. And sometimes positive evangelical fandom, born of love and purpose, is crucial in carving out an identity. It creates desire, it starts a movement. Even if individual people are not always loyal to that movement, they can sense when there's emotion within it, they can be swept along with it, they sense the excitement. And that strong emotional connection does create participation, which I think is rather important in this day and age, and advocacy. But before I go any further, there's something I really need to get off my chest. You sharp acolytes. Not all data is created equal. Asking direct questions in these surveys does give you answers, just not necessarily meaningful answers. And this was brought into sharp relief for me, pardon the pun, by his description of a survey in which people were asked about the reasons for their choice of holiday destination. And he said the survey delivered the same responses regardless of the destination. Now, to me, that just shows the limitations of the data. It certainly doesn't show that everyone shares the same motivations and benefits and that therefore differentiation is a myth. Where would that take us? So the people that climbed Kilimanjaro in May had exactly the same motivations and narrative for their vacation as those that lay on a beach in the Maldives. I don't think so. Really? Do you believe that? Give you 10 minutes talking to those people and you would soon uncover, I think, quite different drivers' desires and benefits. And I love my mum and you love yours, says Professor Sharp. But if we asked each other and talked to each other for any length of time, I'm sure we would uncover quite significant differences about our mothers, how we feel about them and what their characteristics are, despite the first superficial responses. Data from quant surveys asking direct questions to get to attitudinal understanding is flawed. It's not the God-given truth. So bear that in mind when you draw the conclusion that all users of a category are essentially the same. And anyway, what about need state thinking? Maybe people are the same, but do you know what? I might have climbed Kilimanjaro in May and lain on a beach in the Maldives in September. I'm the same person. They're very differentiated. They're very differentiated experiences. And in the moment of choosing, I would have had completely different values, completely different ways of thinking, and would have connected to different brands in different ways. Targeting isn't the same as targets. So, the data may have media and distribution implications, but if you're trying to craft a compelling brand proposition, then distinctiveness also matters. Byron Sharp is emphatic about this point, but here surely we need to make room for the levels of relevance, positive emotion, and affinity in the distinctiveness game. Some memory structures, for example, are helpful. Some are not. Some you have to dismantle because they stop you moving forward. They make your communication really distinctive and really well branded and can lock you in to irrelevance and a failure to evolve and a loss of love. I gave the example of Special K, the woman in the red costume, distinctive, tick. Powerful branding, tick. Locking Special K into the dated slimming box, oops, tick. But it's a really great memory structure. Lacking relevant meaning, tick. So, we need to move forward. We need some new memory structures. What will those be? How do we decide what they are? How do we decide what emotions we want to create? Oh dear, we're talking about emotions. I think we might be talking about love. And here's the thing. I'm not sure I know how to build a brand, drawing on Sharp's point of view. Do I go all out for penetration immediately? Available everywhere, in your face? Do I forget any notion of careful media targeting? Although sometimes context is the message, or maybe not, in Professor Sharp's world. Is that always equity building? Creating value for the long term? Is there no value in scarcity ever? I don't just buy that. I just don't buy that. I believe brands can have a meaning and a role in culture in people's lives, which generates an emotional response. If you're a brand leader, you want to keep strengthening and cementing that emotional hold. If you listen to what the conversation around Pampers following the vaccine promotion and look at the data, what did that build? Positive emotion, actually affinity. That would be my definition of love. If I look at the conversation at the moment around Always following the Like a Girl Supergoal advertising, it is, and it's Sandpro for goodness sake, it's the closest you could hope to get to love I think, for a brand. I don't believe it's not building positive brand momentum for the long term. Jane talked about sustainability and receptiveness to the brand, and it's pretty hard to do that. If you look at the M&S food, the hold M&S food has over its most frequent food shoppers, they look pretty loved up to me. Perhaps what we should be paying more attention to in this discussion, though, around love, is social purpose. All those examples I've just quoted have found a way to invest real meaning into their brands and beyond the transactional value equation, and as a result, are enjoying the love. Sure, love's not exclusive. It doesn't mean the potential buyers never switch, they never use another brand, or their whole market thinking is not important. But at the very least, it's a powerful ingredient in the brand choice and creates brand advocacy. So let's bring back the love. Love the brands you work on. Love the people who buy them. If you ask me what love's got to do with it, I say everything. I say thank you, Byron Sharp, for your contribution, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Thank you.
Laurence Green is last but not least.
Early applause. Shame it didn't catch on. The traditional role of the closing speech is to be the most adversarial and gladiatorial, but I think Mark did a pretty good job on my behalf earlier. He's to be congratulated on walking the talk, by the way, not just in Diageo, but he is moving. I think I'm allowed to tell people this. He's moving shortly with his family to Boulder, Colorado. And I said, oh, why did you how did you end up there? Do you know people? And he said, oh, no, I just Googled best 100 places to live in America, and Boulder came up number 1. So he absolutely walks the Byron Sharp talk. I'm not moving on the basis of an online survey, much as I hear about Boulder. And I'm not going to be especially gladiatorial or adversarial. I want to echo some of his comments. I want to round them out a little bit, because I actually think Professor Sharp, I didn't even know he was a professor, it suddenly has even more kudos, has actually quite a rounded point of view on how brands grow and how advertising helps them. And I think it's helpful to look at that in the round. So I'm not going to be adversarial. I'm just going to say why I liked his book, if that's not too lame and too disappointing a close, James. Why do I like his book? Firstly, I like stuff that's based on evidence, and I'm sure there are holes in his data and some bad practice, but I think stuff that's based on evidence is a really important corrective for the people in this room. We do way too much thinking, spend way too much of our clients' money on the basis of either modern hunch or really ancient legacy. And I like a bit of evidence in my life. I think it's rare, I think it's precious. It's why I, like Mark, love the IPA awards. And I know that's the other religion and we're not allowed to talk about them again, but that's my gig. And I partly like it because I've been agency side for a long time, and I think agencies have slipped a long way away from what actually works or what tends to assume a slightly softer position. We've become more and more reluctant to admit that we're in the selling business, more and more distant from client top table, just as Mark described, more and more inclined to skim the surface of our client's business. So I'm very grateful for anyone, Professor Sharp, Les Binet, whoever, who can actually bring some evidence to the table about how marketing actually tends to work, which levers still produce the biggest effects. I also recognise the implicit truth in how brands grow, that as marketeers, we massively overestimate the importance of brands and advertising in people's lives, massively. I don't think we should beat ourselves up about that too much, because everyone views the world through the lens of their profession. You'll have your own evidence of this, or you'll know friends who look at the world like lawyers or accountants. My creative director can't walk down the high street without having been sort of, helped back to his, some sort of semblance of normality, because he just sees all the wonky design, all the misplaced iconography. But to evidence this sense that we all, view the world through a kind of skewed lens, I keep going back to a quote that's now decades old. It's from the theatre critic of Taylor and Cutter, which, as you'll all know, was Britain's leading menswear trade magazine. It is now decades old, but you'll get the point. The theatre critic writes, Mr. Michael Dennison goes on stage wearing a peculiarly coloured hacking jacket with a thoroughly inadequate central vent. That's how the theatre critic of a menswear magazine sees a play in the 1960s, and we have our own version of that. We think that everyone's waiting excitably for our ads or brands' tweets, and I think we need to guard against that, because I sincerely believe that you'll do more effective work if you accept rather than deny that consumers, or dare I say people, aren't really interested in most brands. There was a study, I think by Havas last year, that concluded that people couldn't care less if 3/4 of the world's brands disappeared because they had no meaning. This despite many millions of pounds spent on them by their owners over the years. So good luck with the brand love thing if 3/4 of brands are so instantly expendable. I think we do well to remember that we're in the business of nudging the behaviour of the largely indifferent. Why else do I like it? I like it, of course, a bit like the theatre critic didn't like Michael Dennison's hacking jacket. I like it because I find some sort of truths that remind me of things I've discovered over my career. My first contribution as a strategist, a proper one, not just a sort of tone of voice thing, or a like or a share, was actually to stop Weetabix, this is 20 years ago, willfully hoping that they could grow their business by getting people to eat one more bowl. It's an illusion that you can grow frequency in so many markets. You guys eat cereal. If you eat the same cereal more than twice a week, you get bored of it and you stop eating it. I think their new campaign, Jolly Nice Animation, I don't know if you've seen it, someone's nodding here. I think it's absolutely brilliant, and I think it's all about penetration, and I think it will work. It's not about, hey, please try me with strawberries. I also have experience of working on 3 things, probably my only 3 hits in those 25 years, that mesh rather neatly with Byron Sharp's advertising checklist. I worked on Sony Balls, I worked on Cadbury Gorilla, I worked on Skoda Cake. They had nothing to do with persuasion, any of them. They had everything to do with getting noticed, getting, yes, a bit of an emotional response, and a lot to do with reintroducing what he calls distinctive brand assets or brand distinctive assets. They were all explicitly aimed at penetration objectives, and they all grew the brands really quickly. Sony, because the trick is to sell loads of tellies while prices and margins are high. Cadbury, because they were hemorrhaging younger buyers. Skoda, because everybody thought their cars were shit, and they'd been persuaded to speak again and again to a tiny pool of contrary loyalists rather than fix the real problem. Fourthly, I recognise the truths in how brands grow as a consumer. As a person. And there was a survey recently, I don't know if you saw it, it said we take 26 seconds to judge someone's character from first stepping inside their home. I don't know if any of you saw that. I did. All I could say is don't invite me round. I'm way quicker than that. I will judge you within seconds. And that's how I buy. I make really snap decisions when I shop. I often don't know why. I don't even pause to consider why that is so. I might check prices. I don't contemplate brands. And it turns out that a lot of that behaviour, just making my shopping life easier, is because of these long-term memory structures. And I would offer up an anecdote that brings this to life. I'm really not a big fan of McDonald's. Talk to me in theory about McDonald's. I'm really not a big fan of it at all. But here's how my motorway trips with my other half tend to pan out. We should stop off soon and get an M&S sandwich. Oh yeah, good idea. Golden Arches. Fancy a Big Mac? Oh, I'm so glad you said that. I was just thinking that too. Oh, it's okay, no one will see us. Next motorway trip. Oh, there's a little Waitrose at the next service station. Oh, great. Golden Arches. Woof, McDonald's. It's how brands work. It's how brands like that work. Fifthly, I think the book, which I'm a fan of, as is obvious, just makes our life simpler. If we start with a few hypotheses about how we think our advertising will work, we can just get stuff done quicker, and God, we need to get stuff done quicker these days. If we advance our thinking to a point that says, it'll probably work by growing penetration, not frequency, it'll probably work by getting noticed, it'll probably work if we use our brand properties, it'll probably work hard if we stick with it, we cut an awful lot of crap and a lot of time from the endless strategic deliberation we do that gives creatives 2 weeks to come up with some research-proof masterpiece. So it's a manifesto for simplicity, I think, and I salute it in that respect, if no other. Finally, I think, like Mark, he's actually written an accidental charter for better work that's in everyone's interests. Get noticed, do something vaguely emotional, fuck persuasion. So, I'm a fan in general on the narrow issue of brand love, I'm so with him and so not with Kevin Roberts. Byron Sharp reminds us that Love Marks was made up after 2 bottles of red wine. And I worry about that. And I fear that as an industry and as strategists, we want to set brand love as an objective because we think people care passionately about brands. We'd prefer to talk about likes and shares than sales. And because we like ourselves a bit more if we're in the brand love business. Can a few precious brands win a degree of love? Yes, BBC is one. We've heard about others. But I think so many of those are outliers. I think it's very difficult to apply what works for Apple back to Kleenex, Domestos, Mr. Sheen. It's like a non-league footballer telling his boss he wants to play in a sort of floating number 9 role like Messi does. It's just ridiculous. In the end, as I think we always knew deep inside, most brands grow most of the time by reaching out to more people rather than nurturing some delusional country club of loyalists. So, what's love got to do with it? In life, a lot. In branding and selling, only a little. Love is an outcome, not an objective at the best of times, and a particularly dangerous objective for marketing teams to set to the detriment of all else. It takes you to posters for Nescafe that say, because you can't email a hug. What is that about? So I think we've got a choice tonight, but more materially, as individuals and an industry. Do you want to be in the brand love business or the brand growth business? I know who I'd give my business to.
Thank you very much. And before I throw it open to the audience, I'm sure there are some questions from the audience. I'd just like to throw in a couple of questions to the panel. And can I just start off with Mark? How have you been able to sit at the top table and influence decisions at the highest level without inspiring the money, so to speak, as to what your brands can mean to people, without creating that kind of mythology and love?
Yeah, I think the one thing to say is there is a tendency to read Byron Sharp's book and then come to these really kind of much clearer decisions or much clearer points of view than he seems to come to. So we don't think that a brand shouldn't stand for something. We clearly think a brand should stand for something. And so, you know, we want Johnny Walker to continue to stand for something. We want our brands to continue to stand for something. So I think we're not trying to take that away and go, we should just be about anything as long as people notice, it doesn't matter. That's clearly nonsense. However, I think it's a real relief to people in business when you go, do you know, nobody really cares about our brands. They just don't. There's a very small proportion of people who care a lot, and God bless them, and that's great. And if you name your dog Talisker, brilliant. Our job's done. I don't need to market to you. You've named your bloody dog Talisker. I don't really need to do anything else. So you know, what we don't want to do is say the people who are loyal are unimportant, the people who buy a lot, but they are a very small proportion of the overall sales of the brand, and they don't really help you grow. And then if you say to people, I think most importantly what we did with the money at Diageo is to say, go home and look in your cupboard and come back with a list of the tea brands you've got and the shampoo brands you've got and the pasta brands you've got. Because people will claim to only drink Tetleys, and then they come back with a list of 5 teas that happen to be in their cupboard. And it's just natural repertoire buying behavior. And so I think people are quite relieved because this kind of belief that people have to love your brand is kind of scary. Why do you want that? It sounds ridiculous. It's unachievable, frankly. And so why not go for something that feels more achievable? And I think they're quite relieved about that.
Thank you. Kirsty, what do you mean by social purpose? Isn't that just a new way of talking about love that sounds a little bit less gushing?
No, I mean, Mark's just been talking about meaning, and he just said, oh, of course we want our brands to have meaning. I mean, I think what you're really kind of rebelling against really strongly is a notion of exclusivity and exclusive loyalty, rather than love, actually. Because I think the point is people share their love around, and they feel it for different brands and people at different times. When I was talking about, so I do think that people are looking behind brands, maybe because they don't love them, And if you have a sort of purpose and a meaning that's bigger than just the sort of financial transaction, I do think you're building connections with consumers. Now, I don't think that means that you go to their cupboard and they've only got parcel in it, or they've only, although actually you do find quite a few people that do, incidentally. But I do think that you're more likely to get a bigger share within that set, given that it is widely available along with other brands. So it's a meaning that is beyond the sort of transactional value equation.
Can I pick up on that, James?
Please do.
Because I think the problem is that love can lead you astray, which I suspect is
maybe
a
that's right.
popular country song as
Are you
well.
going to break into song? Or?
Yeah, no. No, because in hearing that, I mean, the true tale, not the apocryphal tale of Pepsi versus Coke, even 5 years ago, was a company that this is Pepsi, fell so much in love with its own bullshit around loyalists and love and social purpose that they calamitously committed to a social media project called Pepsi Refresh, which completely diminished all their mental availability because it was just speaking to too few people too sincerely, and I think it cost them billions in revenues and share price. So for every one of those, there's a corollary and a competing example. But I just think when you overcommit to love, I think you can miss the point, and I think you can damage your brands rather than embellish them.
I think you can, but I think in the same way that you can damage your brand, I mean, to give another Pepsi example, Tropicana, they damaged their brand by changing their packaging. I mean, I think you can damage your brand with essentially bad decision making and bad communication decisions and bad messaging decisions. But I don't think that denies I mean, Pepsi's probably a big challenge to invest a social purpose within.
Yep.
But I don't think it denies that I think we will see more of it. And I think the Pampers example, the Always example, the Persil example, the Knorr example, the Domestos example, the Lifebuoy example, won't use Lifebuoy because it's overused. There's lots of examples of brands that I think are connecting in a different way. And I guess my concern, if you slavishly apply the Byron Sharp, I feel like it sucks love and positive emotion out of the equation completely. And I guess that's what I'm arguing against.
Jane, your points are fine for the BBC, surely, and geared towards making a specific case to a rather hostile government at time. But isn't that different from what commercial organisations are facing? Their markers of success are definitely profit, aren't they?
Yeah, rather hostile government at times. No, I don't think it is specific to the public sector, actually. I think in the commercial sector, brand love applies as well. And I think there are probably certain sectors where your emotional connection with brands is stronger or it plays a bigger role. So I think certainly in the case of media brands where you have editorial, I think it plays a very strong role. People actively choose newspapers because of their editorial point of view. They actively don't choose newspapers for the same reason. But I think you can apply it to different sectors as well. I think even if you think about sort of FMCG as a sector and you think about things like M&Ms, you think about things like Coke, people badge themselves with these brands because they have meaning, because they love them. So I don't think it's just applicable to the BBC. I think it's applicable across the board.
Who wants to contribute and challenge from the audience? I'm sure there's some people who will have something to say. Do we have any rants or interjections? Maybe the microphones could come over to this gentleman in the blue shirt. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. It's really interesting. I've actually been lucky enough to meet Professor Sharp and, in fact, Professor Romanik, or however Jenny pronounces her surname, a couple of times as well, and heard their views and find a lot of value in them. But I also have a little bit of a foot in the other camp because I do think that emotional connection is important to any brand. For a brand to be long-term successful, it can't just grow by share. But I have an example of a brand in my mind of somebody who does a brand that exactly does that. Almost nobody will have ever heard of them, but all of us will use that brand. In our homes, there are probably tens, if not even hundreds, of examples of this brand, and it's a brand called Accuride, and they make drawer slides. And I was working for a PR company, and we had a little event, and somebody came along and she said, all you're saying about how we can grow our brand presence and brand love and connection with our customers through social media is very interesting, but our entire marketing activity is spent on making sure we get a decent placement in catalogues of drawer and cabinetry supplies, because nobody actually knows our brand. They just know that they want the slides that we make because we're pretty much the best manufacturers of those products. And I found that very interesting that somebody whose title was marketing and comms, it was a joint position, but their point of view was actually there isn't a love for our brand. There's just we're a functional brand that has no need to be loved. We actually are successful without it.
Is that a brand?
I was going to say.
I mean, we'd get into definitions of brands, I guess, which
Yeah.
just a question. Yeah.
And I think that's a fair question, but they seem to do
Yeah.
a lot of it.
Yeah.
I think there was a question over here, gentleman in the blue jacket. And you are, and his neighbour next.
Thanks for that, really interesting. The Nest Cafe example made me think of a Bovril example at the moment. There's a very similar sort of campaign from a gravy company about basically, connecting people throughout the world. And I just thought, what utter bullshit is this? But, I mean, I suppose my question is, surely there's a difference between different types of brands. We're talking about brands here, and we're sort of throwing out examples. Most of the examples are FMCG. But surely you feel differently to a clothing brand. You feel in a different way to, for example, French Connection or Zara or something than you do to Persil or a bleach brand or a car brand. I mean, what's the difference? Surely, actually, love does apply to something like a clothing brand in the way it doesn't to a toilet cleaner.
Does anybody want to comment on that?
Yeah, we need to be really careful, I think, with the metaphors that we use in marketing. And we use metaphors like love, and then it starts to take on a life of its own. What Byron Sharp would never say is that you don't want positive emotional associations with your brand. So for people to say, well, he's not for love, but that means he's not for positive emotional associations, is just nonsense. What Sharp would say is you need a lot of associations to be a big brand, and you need as many of those to be positive. And to your point, depending on the category, some people are incredibly attached to Persil, and other people are incredibly attached to their car, and that just happens in that category. So I think the types of emotions that exist may surprisingly exist in categories you don't expect them to exist, but I suspect in clothing brands may have a slightly more, higher emotional content than detergent brands. Again, not surprising in general.
I don't know if it's true.
Please.
I was quite keen to ask you about Tesco's. So, Jane, I really liked your point that you said about love being important for protecting the future of a brand and maintaining that love. And I don't think that the reason why Tesco's doing so badly is just on love alone. And obviously, I know that the others will probably be arguing that. But Kirsty, what do you think in terms of the love of the brand is why Tesco are failing and Sainsbury's, for example, is still surviving?
But I think Jane will have something to add to this, but I think it would go back to Jane's point when she was talking about when you have a reservoir of goodwill and connection and affection, you can ride the tough times more readily. I don't think that Tesco had that. I think that it was used, it was convenient, it delivered things that you needed when you wanted to. But I assure you, if you were speaking, which I was, to Tesco, very regular, if you're looking at behavioural data, regular Tesco shoppers, which is a very different thing from attitudinal data, which was my point, that the attitudinal data is not very robust. It was actually resented but used by a lot of people. So I think that's partly why you're seeing the sort of situation that's unfolding now.
I think it's the idea as well that, I mean, we're deliberately being quite black and white about, is it reach, is it love? Yeah. The reality is, of course, it's both, and you kind of need both, and brand relationships are quite complex things. So I think, you can kind of argue the case one way or the other, but I think at the end of the day, you sort of couldn't, in my view, you can't have one without the other anyway. And at different points in your life cycle, you will need different things. I think there are certain brands that are long established that actually maybe prominence is fine for those brands because everyone already knows what they stand for and they've already formed their opinions. I think there are other brands that are just starting out where they have to create meaning behind them. And arguably there you might have something like brand love comes into play a little bit more strongly.
But I do think you get reluctant users. I think that's my point.
Before I take another question from this side of the room, I've just realised that I've done the cardinal sin of not mentioning tonight's hashtag, which is APG brand love, isn't it, Simone? Thank you. Gentleman over there. Yes, you, sir.
Hi. Thanks very much. Some really, really interesting points of views tonight. I think this is a really, really important subject. It's great that we're having an APG session on this. I think we need to continue to discuss this. I'd like to ask the panel about their point of view on considered purchases. I think, I totally buy Laurence's point about making sure that we don't think or look at things in a very myopic way, sort of let's look broader than our own worldview. And I think one of the challenges to Byron Sharp, if I remember, is that a lot of his data was based on FMCG. And I mean, it's quite ironic that given we're in Google, no one has mentioned the zero moment of truth theory, where actually in considered purchases, people are looking online, the importance of social proof to prove that the decision that they're making is right or not, and the value of reviews. In that context, isn't it still important to encourage the people who are really close to your brand to perhaps reveal their love through reviews to other people so that they can follow suit? Love for you to talk about that.
I mean, that's another. You're going to make us agree if you're not careful, because I think often fandom drives penetration rather than frequency, and I believe that of Apple, and I believe that of a whole heap of other brands, including some of Mark's, maybe more than he does. So yeah, I think that the debate becomes quite binary. I think in the end, we're mapping our way to the kind of the least worst, the least damaging perspectives on the world. And I find the least damaging one to be that you should reach out for more prospects, more noisily and emotionally, even in cars, because I think the distinction made about different categories was really good, but I think it's even true in cars, because the biggest car brands have small shares. There's a bigger pool of prospects and more sales beyond their franchise than within their current one. So, yeah.
We can't have a panel which is cosily sort of reaching a nice agreement. What do you guys really still disagree on passionately? That's what I want to know.
I can tell you one thing that I disagree on. If I was trying to be argumentative and picking up on points that you both made, I would say that you were both arguing in favour of simplicity. So when you talked about having evidence, that the idea that you can make a decision that feels quite simple because you've got it there in front of you, it's black and white, was part of your pro case. And also, Mark, the idea that there's no place for emotions at the board table. So, it's much easier to argue the case when you've kind of got numbers in front of you. So I would ask both of you whether or not that was intended, that actually is it about simplicity and being able to be black and white about things that makes this quite appealing. So the idea that Byron Sharp has written something that people can hang on to, is that just the appeal of his philosophy?
Well, yeah, I would ascribe to anything that's simple before anything that's complex. I hope most people would. So if this helps simplify, then it's got my vote immediately. I'm not sure that it's kind of, all models are versions of reality, so that we have to accept as scientists or marketers. So yes, every model is a simplification of what happens in the real world, but this is a pretty good simplification of what goes in the real world, because when you throw data at it, it doesn't break. So, and that's a test of a good model. So I'm always going for simplicity, but I think this model just chews data up and spits it back out. And, we've challenged people. We said to people, bring us the data that proves that this is wrong, because what do we know? And we've yet to see it.
I think we have time for two more. We don't want the booze to lose its coldness. Front row, flowery and distinctive.
Thanks very much. My name is Richard and I'm a direct marketer. It's a great relief to have got that out there. Because of what I do, I've spent an awful lot of my life around the deluded denizens of your country club, of extreme loyalists. And I remember a few years ago working for a Diageo brand where my brief was to increase the share of bonded adorers within your customer database. I'm just wondering, these 20%, 10% in some circumstances of very, very bonded, frequent customers, should we just be ignoring them? Especially as research also shows that frequent users of a brand also tend to be heavy users of the category.
No, we shouldn't be ignoring them. And the theory would state that you need to reach all category buyers, not just light buyers. The beauty of people that have liked a brand on Facebook or have signed up for your database is you can reach them for nothing. And as long as you reach them with something sort of decent, it's an amazing relationship. What pisses people off immensely is when they sign up for a relationship and then you stop talking to them, which people do on Facebook. So, or we create loyalty programs for Guinness, and classic taxi driver story. I'm sitting in a taxi in Dublin. The guy's telling me about how much he loves Guinness, and he always got a voucher every Christmas. And it suddenly stopped, and he's really pissed off about it. So, you have to go into these things with your eyes wide open. But what we know for certain, and McKinsey has confirmed this, is that the best form of communicating with people still is direct mail. The response and the sales are not direct mail, sorry, email. So, yes, let's talk to them. It's bloody cheap. It's easy to do. And if we do nice things for them, they become those fans that people talked about here. They talk to their friends and say, this wonderful malts offer, are you interested? So, no, we shouldn't ignore them.
Equally, I don't think you should look at them and go, hey, wouldn't it be great if everyone in our franchise was a bonded adorer, and spent too much time trying to get other people who are on the edges of the category equally valuable, much more easily swayed, frankly. That's the real trap, I think, with those people, that they're a misrepresentation of a massive base of sales.
I think we have time for one more. Another flowery shirt.
Thank you. That was a really, really interesting discussion. I was just thinking about the fact that we live in a time where consumers are increasingly cynical about brands and are actually looking cynical about big brands. They're looking to smaller brands that have more of a sort of personal story, that feel less like they represent the corporate machine and a sort of something a bit meaningful. And I was just wondering, what's the implication of that for the penetration argument?
It's a good question. I think it's a fantasy sometimes. So people go, well, niche brands are, there are niche, but there aren't niche brands. They're big brands and small brands. That's all there are, sadly. So these kind of niche brands that are have huge social purpose and are just small. Nobody really cares much about them, sadly. Hopefully they build a broader set of associations. I do, however, think the point you make is an important one, which is things shift in marketing, and things in marketing or in life or in culture are shifting to those kinds of brands. And therefore, big brands need to acknowledge that shift and either react or ignore or find a way to deal with it. So this isn't a case of just, we're big and we're just going to make big TV ads and ignore everything that's going on. You have to remain culturally relevant and find a way to present yourself in a culturally relevant way. And maybe the day of big brands is decline. Maybe there is going to be a decline. I think it will decline to a certain point and then stop because most people don't care enough. It's like, do I really want to think about my beer every time I go out? Can't I just have a bloody Budweiser? It's just like, there's 50 beers and I'm sick of the endless conversations about them. So who knows? It's fascinating stuff.
Picking up on something Jane challenged earlier, I think the neuroscience work is telling us that our brains are lazy, that brands have a hold on us because they are simplifiers. So simple is good. And I would take you back to the title of the book. It's called How Brands Grow. So it's not what's the steady state of that brand. If those owners want it to grow, how are you going to grow it? And that's what takes this side, and I suspect over a glass of wine,
Yeah.
the opposite sex, weirdly, as it's played out, to a slightly different place, which is set your reach wide, try and forge a flimsy but valuable emotional connection with as many people as you can. That's how I try and grow those brands. And I think most of us are being asked by our clients to grow their brands. Jane's being asked to shrink her brand by some people, but most of us are being asked by clients to grow their brands, and that's why I think this is really important, that you reach your own conclusions on your brands in the categories you work in, because then you've got something to map your plans and activity and results against.
I just wanted to say one thing though. When you were talking about niche brands, they're just small brands and that's it. But some of these brands they steal mind share, don't they? They steal some of the values that you used to own, and those values are sometimes the values that forge connections and identity, and that's where I think we're in the love game. And it depends what our definition of love is, but I do think you have to pay attention to them and look at them, because they can impact your kind of connections, whether they're small or large.
You just have to be certain that those values make one iota of difference when somebody's got 15 minutes in the supermarket to choose between 30,000 items.
Yeah, but I'll give you the example. No, but I'll give you the example of the Levi's brand, which was focusing on, we're going back 10, 15 years, but Levi's was only focusing within the denim category. It wasn't looking at what was happening outside. Oh yeah, there's all these kind of workwear brands, but we won't worry about those. Well, they should have done, because actually they came in, they stole some of Levi's values, they took the heartland of the category, and they saw dramatic change. And so I do think sometimes, and it's understanding when it's important and when it's going to have real significance for your brand, rather than chasing it from a volume point of view.
Yep.
There has been quite a lot of talk of alcoholic beverages in the talk this evening, and there are some over there. And I think it's probably a time to draw things to a close. In the words of David Dimbleby, this isn't a representative sample, but we couldn't finish it in any other way than doing a quick show of hands. Who is in favour of the love side of the argument?
Come on. Oh, I can even split.
And who's in favour of the other side of the argument?
Oh, come on, we won. We definitely won. We definitely won.
I too close to call. Oh. Too close to call. Thank you all very, very much for attending, and thank you so much to our panel.